Okay, what the hell was that exactly? Welcome to CCB3. Unlike most Max Risk clears, I want to go in depth into how Max Risk was achieved. We'll be covering almost everything from the operators to the enemies, as well as general game mechanics, and detailed information that even you can make use out of in your day-to-day experience, starting with the enemies. For each of them, I'll be showing their stats as they are, assuming you have unlocked all risks. The most interesting aspects will be their special abilities and defensive stats, as excluding the Wizard Vanguards or other enemies will effectively always kill the operators present in a single strike. As a reminder, your operators only have 50% of their maximum HP, but all the enemies also gain very significant attack buffs, even more so if they are sitting in polluted tiles or in the storm. And say polluted tiles or storm are covering almost the entire stage. As such, unless specified otherwise, taking damage from an enemy directly means your operators will die instantly. Back on topic, for the Wizard Vanguards, they are not a big threat and are usually dealt with by the Vanguard that you have available, and they are sufficiently squishy that they can be also dispatched by Logos, Ela or Mobu. Overall, they are not a big threat and will usually die alongside other enemies. Wizard Bulwarks are nothing special. They have extremely intimidating stats, sporting on very impressive 12,000 defense, and that's even while being outside of a polluted tile, and 90 res. This is extremely intimidating, and one of the main reasons why you can't bring physical DPS, but it's not really a problem because we are using QB as a main damage dealer, so for the doggo, they are non-issue. Even though they spot 90 res, even with no other debuff, QB will still be able to deal significant damage to them. So any amount of crowd control will be sufficient to kill them with very little issue. We'll also be using a few operators, Ifrit, QB, and Sudaram, and simply having a single Bulwark coming into their range is enough to get rid of them. So they're not a big deal. Caustic slugs are very similar to your standard explosive slugs, with a few differences. When they die, they also explode. While it does say that it can be silenced here, one of the risks will actually prevent you from silencing them. As such, you have to be very careful with your positioning. The other aspect is that if they get within an Originium storm, they will die instantly and increase the size of the storm. As such, the best way to deal with them is simply to, well, either gently nudge them toward the storm or let them walk into it. The biggest issue with them is that the explosion is going to effectively ban some tiles by preventing you from deploying some operators. However, this is a good opportunity to also remind people that there is in fact a difference between camouflage and invisibility. Invisibility will provide immunity to most area of damage effects, including the explosion from the slugs, while camouflage won't. So someone like April, for example, would die even with Skeletal active next to one of the slugs once they die, but not someone like Ines, or more relevant later, someone like Magaman using drones. All in all, not the biggest threat. The biggest issue is going to be at the very start when it comes to setting up the storm and making sure that there is a clear path between where the slugs are spawning and toward the blue box. So Maelstroms are dealt in a very similar manner to the Caustic slugs, except instead of using the storm to actually deal with them, the best way is to let them be absorbed by the Soul Remnants. I'm not going to go into details as to the entire mechanics there, since they will get a separate section, but basically you need to make sure that the Soul Remnants get a maximum of 3 charges, so you just need to empty the charges every now and then, and they will simply be absorbed, and you won't have to worry about the Maelstroms. Case of Regret is an interesting one. It's a flying unit that is immune to most crowd control effects. The most important one that it is not immune to is actually Fear, which is easily obtainable from Nymph. More on that later. Without the risk, the Chalice of Regret usually has 0 defense, meaning the best way to deal with it is actually to bring marksman snipers that have very high DPS, even if their damage per hit is pretty low. So someone like Exo, for example, is pretty standard. In CCB3, you don't really get that much of a luxury because it does get a flat 300 defense. The biggest pain point with it is that it has almost 500,000 HP, and you don't really have the means to destroy it all that easily. 2 of them will spawn during the stage, one of them can be dealt with the storm, the second one can be dealt in one of 2 ways. Either you abuse the fact that some of the enemies within its range are going to take a lot of damage, or alternatively, you can just decide to stall it with Nymph, as mentioned before. Profane Chimeras are some of the most intimidating enemies in this particular CC due to the absolutely extreme amounts of defensive stats. 90 rares means that, in effect, QB is not going to be doing that much damage to them unless you can bring some pretty serious res debuff to the table. So these debuffs can be either Gnosis through the use of his freeze ability, and or Ifrit, since by default she's going to reduce the res of all enemies within range by 40%, and an additional 20 flat with her skill 3 active. The math is a bit more complicated than this when it comes to res, but in effect just keep in mind that Ifrit is almost mandatory if you actually want to burst them down reliably. They are just that tanky. The other aspect is their aura. If they are centered on a tile and get hit by pollution, in effect they are banning all tiles in a 3x3 area around them. So because of this, most of the maps will be banned for most of your operators. There are some ways to counter it, one of those being to use Chilchuck, since he provides immunity to environmental effects and the pollution is considered as one, and invisibility. Invisibility, as we've seen before, provides immunity to AoE effect, so some Magadan, for example, could keep herself alive, or Ines. Finally, the last thing to remember is that during CC, they get to block, which is actually a benefit to us because that means we have extra spot to deploy our agent Vanguards to generate DP early on. So that's a pretty good thing. Sudarams are pretty dangerous enemies, since as long as they are on polluted tiles, they can also target any allied operators who is also being affected by any form of pollution. In CCB, this is effectively a one-shot. On top of this, they have immunity to several forms of crowd control, so no freezing, sleep, or stunning them will work. You can still shift them with Witty, and you do have to take great care of this. The biggest issue is that even if you protect some of your operators using Chilchuck, effectively it only reduces the damage taken to 0 from environmental effects, so Chilchuck and any protected ally will still be a valid target for Sudarams. Altar Keepers are an interesting enemy, and they are inevitably tied to how altars functions. Altars work by simply pulling the storm on their position. No matter where the altar itself is, the storm will also follow, and most importantly, the storm will be precisely at the center of the tile where the altar is. That is to say, the storm is not centered on the altar itself. As for the altar keepers, they are a very basic enemy. They are decently tanky due to the various risk, but the only really important skill that they have is that they are going to pick up the altar if it gets within range. If they die, they will drop the altar on their location, which can be troublesome because you want to keep control of where the altar is, and because the storm can get pretty large, you could risk banning most of the tiles. However, it is possible to have some pretty fine control over where the altar is being positioned. Now this is up to you. So let's say you are in this position and you are not allowed to redeploy Witty because you wouldn't have time to get her back in time. And using the cannon, how do you move the altar to the yellow circle marked in finish? Oh, and you are not allowed to place the cannon in any of the tiles that are barred in red. So, you can pause the video and try to solve it for yourself. One way to go about it is to deploy the cannon and push the altar to the right once, wait for the redeployment, and then push the altar all the way to the top. The altar will be in a corner and the keeper won't be able to grab it while passing through. Note that in CCB, the altar keeper will go through the middle of the tile, so this particular example is easier to pull off than in the actual CCB, but the idea is there. Next up, the test is pretty similar. You still need to push the altar in the same final position, however there are more tiles that are banned. So we can't exactly pot the cannon and push the altar to the right as we did before. So how does one go about it then? It certainly looks a lot more complicated. You can try to solve it by yourself. This approach is what is used for the max risk clears, especially the optimized one. Basically, the idea is to place the cannon opposite of Witty's direction, and we want to use the fact that the cannon is firing against Witty's S3 to actually push the altar just enough that we can still push the altar up once you activate Witty's skill. So pay attention. You activate with the skill, and the cannon is going to fire very soon after and prevent the altar from being pushed too far. And then we can just use the second redeployment of the cannon to finish pushing the altar all the way up. The reason why it's used in CC is because you actually want to move the altar quite a few tiles in order for the storm to absorb more projectile tiles and increase its size. So keep that in mind for the CC. There is one final way in which it can be used to do it in a single deploy of the cannon. So this time around we're just deploying the cannon up, and we use with its scale as the altar is being pushed up. Now, as mentioned, this is not used for CC because we actually need the altar to be moving before going up, but it's nice to know that you can also do it in a single deployment. Focus remnants are a pretty complicated unit to deal with. In theory, they are not that complicated, even if they are absurd in some degrees. They are pretty tanky due to their 90 res and will need some debuff if you actually want to kill them directly, but we're actually going to be using the storm to deal with them, so they are not actually that big of a deal when it comes to eliminating them. The big issue is that they have a very long range attack because of the risks that are involved, so in effect they are banning the right side of the map, half of it. Which is pretty annoying, but since we are going to be using the storm to deal with them, we are not actually banning that many tiles in the first place, so it's actually fairly okay. What is more complicated is their beam attacks, because while they use soul maelstroms as ammunition for that beam attack, which is targeted at any operator that are horizontal or vertical to their own position, This is a bit more complicated, and before we actually deal with this, I need to talk about parallel universes. No, just kidding, we are going to talk about game ticks and search cycles instead. So, I swear this is going to be relevant, bear with it for a moment. Game ticks basically refer to the game itself updating the state of all the entities that are currently on the field. It does so at 30 frames per second. I should say at 30 ticks per second to be more accurate, but that means that 30 times per second the game is going to update the position of all projectiles, it's going to update the HP, the duration of everything, 30 times per second, assuming you are playing at ×1 speed. As for search cycles, it's a specific kind of operation that units can do to actually look for targets. So let's get into it and take a look at an actual example. Chimera will be our test subject here. Take a look at the projectile closely. It will not move in a continuous manner, but instead is going to update its position every time a tick happens. So here I'm using a key that allows me to move 1 frame at a time, and you can see that the projectile keeps teleporting itself a short distance. All until it actually hits the slug, which when it does, it's actually going to calculate the damage. We can take a look at the DP bar. The DP bar is going to update itself also 30 times per second because you generate 1 DP per second, which is a very convenient way of tracking when ticks are actually happening. If the bar moves, then that means a tick has just been executed. Now that we understand how ticks function, we can take a look at search cycles. A search cycle is basically a unit, allied or enemy, taking a look at the valid targets within range. So medic taking a look, for example, at allies to see who can be healed and who they should be prioritizing. For most damage operators like Keeper, it's looking for an enemy to actually fire a projectile at, etc, etc, etc. This happens every 3 frames, which technically means that you could very well have a valid target and get within the range of an operator, but the operator not reacting until the next search cycle. This is going to be extremely important when we come back to the Soul Remnant, so keep that in mind. 2 extra bonuses when it comes to search cycles: it's completely independent. Keeper can be on the search cycle, still 3 frames, that differs from just Cruise, who is also going to be on 3 frames, but they don't have to be in sync with each other. That means that while Keeper may spot a slug as soon as it gets within range, Cruise might only spot that one on the next search cycle, which can be 1 or 2 frames later. One final point: search cycles can be reset, because they are actually only active once the enemy or ally is being deployed, but you can also reset it through the use of various ground control effects like stun or sleep. So if you stun a group of enemies, you will in fact sync all of their search cycles. Back to our Soul Remnants. As a reminder, a Soul Maelstrom arrives, they get consumed, and a beam is used. If you actually retreat an operator, the last deployed within that range, then the animation will still play, but the beam will not appear and no damage will be dealt. So this is a way to go about actually baiting their attacks. Now, there are a few restrictions. For example, for tacticians, if you retreat just the main body, it doesn't actually count really as retreated, and so the beam will still fire. However, if you do it for the clones for Mumu, or if you do it for the crabs for Beanstalk, this is going to function as long as you are not retreating the main body. So if you just cancel those on the sides, it's going to be just fine. As is this case here, where 2 clones have been retreated and the beams have been cancelled properly. Notably, you can deploy a bunch of operators, but for the vast majority of them, nothing will happen for 1 second after deployment, including for a bunch of faster deploys. For example, Waifu had time to activate her skill, but she never got targeted. This has nothing to do with search cycle, it's just that most operators are untargetable during 1 second after deployment. There are exceptions to this, so Ines, for example, using skill 3, is targetable right as she is deployed, and as you can see, the enemy is already preparing a beam attack, at which point you can retreat Ines and cancel the beam as usual. The same is true for Texas Ultra. With this in mind, timing is very important. If we deploy too soon, a basic attack will be done. In Max Risk, it will be enough to actually kill Gravel, and then the beam attack will follow. But if you also do it too late, because she isn't targetable for 1 second, the beam attack will happen even if you were to retreat Gravel in time, which is where Tex Alter actually comes in. The instant activation is extremely useful because it allows you to time very precisely when you want to bait the attack. This is where what we saw previously with the search cycles actually comes in. So you can see on this frame that frame 0, the enemy doesn't actually have a charge. The Soul Maelstrom is not quite on top of it, and Texas Alter is ready to be deployed but not deployed yet. This is when this search cycle happens. So the enemy looks for a target. Texas Alter not being deployed yet means that nothing is going to be happening. On the next frame, there is a very subtle difference. The Soul Maelstrom is no longer here. There is no more shadow, it has been absorbed by the enemy. Which means that the enemy currently has a charge, even if it's not currently visible by the effect. But if a search cycle were to happen on this exact frame, it would be capable of using it right away. In which case, Myrtle would be the one targeted, even if you actually use a pause deploy to deploy Texas right this instant. On the next frame, we actually deploy Texas. But do note that the enemy is still not targeting anyone, because remember, the search cycle happens every 3 frames. The search cycle, the initial one, starting on frame 0. So 0, 1, 2, and the next one will be on 3. Talking of which, this is the last frame, and this is when the enemy actually starts his attack animation and actually targets Texas Alter because she is the last deploy within range, at which point you can just retreat Texas and the beam will be properly cancelled. For the next part, I'd like to highlight some operators who have a particularly exceptional performance in that CC. Said operators are not necessarily going to be present in the final clear, but their performance is good enough that they are worthy of mention. Even if some of them are actually used for several max risk strats, Magellan for example, and even if I don't use Magellan for the final clear, she is pretty potent, and a better understanding of them will be helpful to you in the future. Starting with Puzzle. Puzzle is usually seen as a pretty weak agent because it doesn't quite have the same kind of features that they provide, but his special talent means that if he hits a target at full HP, he's going to generate a lot of SP, which means he can activate his skill 1 over and over again, and you can see him compete with Mithril and Elysium. Surprise, surprise, both in this CCB and the next one, he can find some use, as will be shown in later examples. This next one has to do with not QB, but Texas Alter. People tend to default to using Texas Alter skill 3, however there's a good reason why you might be using Texas Alter skill 2 instead. As you can see, it takes quite a few hits for QB to actually take down the Bulwark. But Texas Alter skill 2 comes with a pretty significant res reduction. no less than 30% for 10 seconds. And that is enough to very significantly change the damage done. It literally multiplies it several times over and means that QB can just kill the Bulwark in much fewer hits. Next on our list is Nymph, specifically her S2. It applies fear to the target, forcing it to move away from the source, Nymph herself in this case. If there is nowhere for the target to run, however, it will randomly run within the tile on which it already is, or if it happens to reach the tile which is its final destination. To cover the more technical side, basically you draw a line from Nymph to the target, and on impact you draw an angle of 90 degrees, or 45 degrees to either side, and basically the game is going to do a search for all valid tiles within that range. So if the black tiles are considered walls, the enemy right here will have nowhere to run, so it's going to randomly run within the red square that's drawn near. However, if we are to take a slightly different situation where it is slanted, keep in mind that the angle in blue is supposed to be 90 degrees, then several tiles, highlighted here in green, are going to be considered valid. One of these is going to be picked at random and will be the next checkpoint that the enemy has to reach. Once it reaches a tile, as mentioned before, it's going to walk in small circles within that tiles until the effect expires. Do note that there is a maximum range here highlighted by the tile in dark green. With all this, what is Nymph used for? Well, stalling some specific targets, specifically the Chalice in CCB, but she does run into one particular issue, that her SP sustain is not quite enough to actually permastall a target on her own. Given enough time, the target in question will be able to actually move forward, and here we go, no more stalling. Alright, so we are going to need some SP support to make sure that we can actually permastall on enemy forever. With this in mind, we have a few parameters that we can take into account. The skill costs 12 SP, it fears on enemy for 5 seconds, and in an ideal situation, the enemy is going to walk away for 5 seconds, but then he needs to walk back for an additional 5 seconds, which is part of what makes Nymph's skill so strong in the first place, because while the skill duration is only 5 seconds, in effect it takes 10 seconds for the enemy to come back to its original position, assuming, of course, that the enemy walks in a straight line and doesn't take shortcuts. On top of this, there is an SP lockout of 1.1 second. SP lockout is effectively when you activate an operator's skill, they cannot gain any SP for the duration. So in a way you could consider it to be an SP cost of 13.1, but you gain SP right after you cast the skill. That could be one way to take a look at this. So the question is, how much SP recovery, that is extra SP sustain provided by other operators, do we need to achieve, at least in theory, a permanent stall? If you want, you can just grab a piece of paper and try to do the math yourself. Come on, I'm sure you can do it. No? Okay, let's get to the next page then. To actually go through over this, we can actually do the math. It's the cost divided by the X, which is the SP recovery that we want to find out, plus the duration of the lockout, which is equal to 2 times the fear duration, which is 5 seconds, because we need to take into account that we're walking in the direction and then in the way back. And we can solve it, and we find X, which is equal to 1348, and so on. We're going to simplify it and say it's 1.35. So basically, with natural SP recovery being just 1 SP per second, we need 35 SP per second provided by other operators. So a Pteopsis, in theory, with her module, is enough to actually provide a permastall. Nice, so we just need to bring Pteopsis to the table. But it's not quite as easy as this. Because, as mentioned, we did say if the enemy walks in a straight line, then we are going to be fine. But that's not really what we are seeing, because the enemies very often take some pretty weird angles, they walk in place and waste a bit of that uptime. So you want slightly more than this. Luckily, Maelstrom, even with a basic module or no module at all, will provide 0.4 SP per second to your operators. And on top of this, she can actually activate S3 if it is required. We do note that you need to activate Maelstrom's skill as the enemy is walking in Nymph's direction, because if you activate it as the enemy walks away, you are wasting some of that field duration. So let's see what exactly it means in practice. If the enemy is walking in a straight line, as mentioned, you can just spam the skill with no fear of running out. Now with the Chalice it's going to be a bit more difficult since it's a flyer, but as mentioned before, you can just use Maelstrom if need be to give Nymph a few extra seconds to actually recover a skill. Before we finally get into the runs, I'd like to talk about potentials for a bit. Usually when it comes to pull recommendations, a bunch of people ask, is it worth to pull duplicates of every single operator? The advice is going to remain the same, and even following this video, hopefully it should remain clear, is that no, you should not be pulling for duplicates of your operators, because in the vast majority of cases, it's not going to be significant enough. The clears I've done are all using a fairly low potential for all my operators, with the obvious exception to the 4 stars and the support unit, who specifically needed P6 for several of the strat that I've used in several of my runs. Unless you are intent on actually competing for the lowest number of operators in a max risk clear in CCB, there is no reason whatsoever for you to try and get multiple copies of operators. Because ultimately, -1 or -2 DP is not going to be significant enough for the crushing majority of content. You can clear IS at Ascension 18 without issues, you can clear Air ACC without issues, CCB Max Risk and Low Ops Clear specifically is the only content as of today which has such stringent requirements. I am excluding any kind of niche because niche clears are by default restricted, and I am going to exclude them for this purpose. Obviously, if you are trying to get a world record for something in particular, then yes, you will need absolutely everything on your side to actually get said clear. The first point is about DP. If you have, say, 10 operators and each and every single one of them costs 2 less DP thanks to potentials, that means that after deploying 10 of those operators, you're saving up on 20 DP. Not only is that already quite a bit by default, but on top of this, you have to consider that we are getting a -75% DP generation. It would take 80 seconds of natural generation to get that much DP back. That is a lot, which is why I want to insist that if you actually do take a look at max risk clears, you have to keep in mind that these strats work specifically because all the operators, or nearly all the operators, are at maximum potentials. Out of curiosity, I already attempted to do some of these max risk clears, but DP was such an overwhelming issue. It is also a compounding issue for several other reasons. I'm not going to delve into too much detail, but in effect, consider that any DP that you don't have to pay for an operator is also going to allow you to generate more DP further down the line. This is true, for example, for Chilchuck, because if you can just place your Vanguards earlier, they get to generate DP earlier. So there is a compounding effect which is at play. The other effect, which is not related to DP, is actually performance. This has to do with the usual trio of QB, Sudaram, and Ifrit. Each of them have at least one potential which is going to act as a multiplier to the overall damage that you are going to do. Now, QB is the basis for this, but in that particular case, we just assume a base of 100 damage or 100 defense. If you are hitting a target at 100 defense, this is just to make it simpler with a percentage, you can see the comparison. QB is going to do percent of the target's defense as arts damage, which is going to be increased by potentials. Sudaram's fragile effect, while S3 is active, is going to go from 44 to 50% fragile effect, which is a very large difference and one of the most significant potentials that you have in the game as of today. 6% from a single potential is pretty strong. As for Ifrit, a res reduction is increased, and it is particularly significant considering the kind of enemies that you're dealing with often have 70 or 90 res. The Chimeras, which are one of the tankiest enemies out there, have 90 res. All in all, if you are against a 90 res target, if you were to compare QB, Sudaram, and Ifrit, all the potential 1 versus all of them at potential 6, this is about an 18.3 DPS increase. This is very significant. Imagine just using them and for free you get an additional stackable fragile effect for 18.3%. That is a lot. So if you struggle to actually replicate some clears, this can be one of the reasons, on top of the DP issues previously mentioned. And with this, we can finally get into the run themselves. I have a lot of recordings. I have over 30 hours and it's been taking most of my disk space. I'm not gonna go into all the runs, but it's just a way to cover some of the thought process that went into how strategies actually came together, because there were a lot of attempts. What you're seeing is effectively the final result, mostly with a few bits in between, just that you get to see how things have changed. I will not spend too much time on this because the final run itself is already going to take a long time and this video is taking already way too long, so let's get to it. The first attempt was built in large part around the DP issue, which is why the altar is actually positioned at the top. You have a risk that allows you to position it either at the top or at the bottom. Puzzle has absolutely insane DP generation, as we saw before, is as good as 2 flybearers just pumping out DP constantly. However, there are a lot of issues with this setup. Funny enough, DP is the issue. Why? Because the altar has to be moved near the bottom because we cannot stay there forever. And what this means is that Chilchuck will not be getting a target. Both Puzzle and Chilchuck have to be retreated, meaning effectively your DP generation is going to stop. Yes, you have enough for the initial setup of Ifrit, Sudaram, QB, and Meganan, but then it stops, and you don't really have many ways to generate more DP. You will need to deploy Chilchuck in order to get some. But again, we have a deployment limit of 5 here, so it's not really an option. The other issue is that Witty has already been retreated. The run is already dead by this point, simply because the altar keepers will be coming in and I don't have enough time to put the altar in a position in which it's not going to be grabbed by the altar keeper. Because the altar was at the top, I had to push it down, and I then proceeded to push it to the right. However, it's not in position. If I push the altar up, it's still going to be grabbed by the altar keeper. I don't have time to deploy the cannon twice, so the run is dead. Woody should have stayed on the field, and as a matter of fact, Magnan here is not doing anything. When the first Chimera arrives, you just need Texas, so the rest of it just crumbles. So we are just going to go directly to the next run. This next attempt fixes a lot of the issues with the previous run and is one which is much later on. The initial run was not on maximum risk. The big difference is that instead of using puzzle, we have a surfer. Surfer can be deployed multiple times and is not going to require a target to be at full HP to actually function. The altar is also at the bottom right from the start. I'm using Mumu here for several reasons. First off, as was visible here, you can use your clones to actually bait the beams, keeping in mind that if you retreat just the main body, the beam is still going to activate, so you do have to keep this in mind. I don't actually need to retreat the clone on this particular attempt, simply because there is no operators that I want to deploy right this instant. But Momo has several strengths here. Besides the fact that she can copy an actual caster, meaning the clones can deal odds damage, she can also bind when skill is active. She also reduces the cost of all Wine Lab operators, which includes Ifrit, so that is another bonus when it comes to helping for DP management. So she brings DP management, baits for the beams, and some crowd control for when enemies are on top of the blue box. The rest of the setup is pretty similar, it's just that Woody stays on the field until the cannon can be deployed again. Note that it is important to move the altar to the left, specifically because Surfer can stay where she currently is. This will also be important much later on when the Sudarams are on the field. Here it is important that Ines is used with scale 3 specifically, because this is what allows her to bind enemies on any position. Texas is used here to bait the beams, is retreated, and for the rest we are going to wait for the chimeras to actually come in. But we do need to prepare the terrain for this. Here there's a very tight timing that has to happen, where the camera is going to be on top of the blue box, and you need to activate Gnosis skill just in time for the camera to actually get frozen on top of the blue box, but not too late, otherwise Gnosis will take damage from the aura. In the meantime, you can notice how Chilchuck was dropped. Chilchuck in this position has quite a bit of time and will be retreated later on. As soon as Gnosis skill 3 ends, we deploy Ella and we drop a mine right on top of the camera, since Sudaram still has not activated their skill. We need to delay the skills as much as possible to make sure that we can kill all 3 chimeras, as well as the incoming altar keepers who is on the right, which is why we have a mine that has been dropped. The idea is to kill 2 of the chimeras and the altar keepers and the remaining chimera. Note that while the scales are being activated for QB and Sudaram at pretty much the same time, it won't always be the case, as you will see later. Here we are going to be using Ines for 2 things. The first one is to use skill 3 to instantly bind, but she will also bait the beam, so the timing is extremely tight. If you mess up, she will die very quickly and screw over your DP generation. Mumu, in the meantime, is already deployed since it takes a bit of time for a skill to be activated, and as soon as the camera gets outside of range, we can deploy the clone. The clone is going to be copying just some random odds damage dealer. Gnosis in this case, it doesn't matter too much. The most important part is that the soul Maelstroms are coming in, and so we need to be ready to summon the clone and retreat them. The timing also has to be pretty well done because the Sudaram at the top is already doing attacks. So you need to be ready to deploy the clones early enough that you can actually bait the beams, but not too soon that the Sudaram can kill them. Here we have a bit of weird timing going on. The camera has to be slowed down to give the Sudaram at the top the time to actually go through the stairs. Because the camera is going to activate the skill, we are going to drop another mine to slow down the slugs and give time to Chilchuck to be deployed, because Chilchuck is used here to protect both Ella and Ifrit. We then retreat Chilchuck as soon as the spiders are about to get blocked by them. Now we have a lot of things happening at this time. Crown Slayer is actually used here to do 2 attacks on the Chimera because we need to delay the Chimera a little bit to make sure that we can just quickly chain both the Chimera itself and the Altar Keeper. The Sudaram also will come from the bottom and will be eliminated slightly thereafter. So we activate both Kyubi and Suzaran, we activate Ifrit, and we need a lot of burst. Now there are some Maelstroms coming in, so a lot of things happening at the same time. We are going to need Ines Bind very quickly. And there we are. The Altar Keeper is bound. I can see he's literally on top of the blue box. At this point, I need to actually bind, but for this last wave, the Soul Maelstrom first goes to the Remnant at the top, so I have a bit of time, and Surfer will be used to actually bait the attack. You can see the Sudaram trying to do an attack against Surfer, but she gets retreated just in time. The important thing to keep in mind is that the Soul Maelstrom still have charges, so 15 seconds later they will use another beam. Weedy at the top, in the meantime, is going to be used to push the Sudaram to the far right, the one at the top. This is to make sure that he is not in the storm and that I can deploy units on polluted tiles without them getting targeted by the remaining Sudaram. So as soon as getting pushed, Weedy is getting retreated. Crown Slayer again is deployed in this particular case as an attempt to actually eat the Chimera and buy a bit of time. You're going to see why this particular run fails. The issue is that this Chilchuck is not at the high potential enough, and so I'm not going to get him in time. While I do have enough damage to actually kill both the Chimeras and Sudaram getting on top of the blue box, Crown Slayer doesn't really buy enough time, and suddenly the Chimera is going to get out of the way. The issue is that, as I mentioned, there is 15 seconds after a beam is used if the Remnants have another charge. So here I'm going to be in a pretty awkward position. If it is going to die to the Chimera regardless, so I'm going to instead be using Ifrit to bait the beam instead of deploying someone else because I have no other ground units available. There we go. And if you take a look on the right side, the Remnant actually has used the beam. I'm a bit of a pickle here with Gnosis. The reason is that I need to activate the skill pretty fast because KOB and Suzaran, without skills, don't have enough damage to actually stop them. I'm also using Chilchuck to try and slightly delay the first Bulwark by using the split box. But I'm running into a bit of an issue. I would have preferred to use Gnosis next to the blue box, but the Soul Remnants are still alive, and because of their range, he would have otherwise died. He can just in time stop them, but it's very tight. Texas is deployed to deal with the Soul Remnant, but it's too late and it actually has enough time to throw projectile, killing Suzaran. At this point, I have no crowd control, that is left to stop the Chimera, and QB has not enough DPS to actually kill it, even with Crown Slayer's assistance and even with Ines. Simply put, that's not enough buffs and debuffs available to actually eliminate it. At this point, the Chimera has free reign to go into the blue box and the run is dead. At long last, we arrive at the very final clear. The beginning is going to be pretty similar, however we are not going to be using a Mumu this time around, because for the very end I actually want to be using both Nymph and Maelstrom to deal with the Chalice. A big difference is that we're going to be using Logos. The reason why we're going to be using Logos is that to ensure that two Remnants on the right side die earlier, I'm going to use him to damage the Chalice, because the two Remnants will die very fast once the Chalice is down. But I need to output some extra damage to it, otherwise it will die too late and it will threaten the position of my operators on the left side of the map. Other than that, most of the setup is pretty similar. So once the altar is moving to the left along with the storm, Logos will be retreated basically as soon as it takes damage, trying to really use the last projectile available. We raise the cannon, and as soon as we see damage tick, Logos gets retreated. I'm going to speed up a bit through the rest of the run because most of it is going to be pretty similar. While the run is being sped up, let's talk a few things about the roster. Texas Hunter has been removed to leave room for Nymph and Maelstrom combo for the very end, and Gravel is just working extra hours, I guess. Chilchuck, in the meantime, has replaced Mumu as the support unit because I need his extra potentials for the reduced deployment cooldown. I didn't get to deploy Chilchuck in time on the previous attempt, so this is where things are getting changed in order to better line things up. Other than this, the rest for now is pretty similar, but there is going to be a difference pretty soon. The last Chimera on the top left is moving, and I'm deploying Ela's mine on top of Ifrit. The reason for it is that some bulwarks are going to come in, and I previously used 2 mines to make sure that Chilchuck can be deployed safely and protect Ela and Ifrit when the Chimera actually passes through. But if you actually place Ela's mine at the top, you slow down the first bulwark enough that you only end up using a single mine, which is the better option of the two. Here Gravel is being used for the bait. We don't need to worry about baiting the top beam just yet. And if you take a look at the left, the Bulwark is slowed down, Chilchuck is available, we are just waiting for the Sudaram to go down the stairs. And we deploy Chilchuck as soon as he disappears. We then retreat Chilchuck before he actually gets destroyed by the Bulwark. And we keep slowing down the Chimera a little bit. We are not using Crown Slayer anymore, but we have a few mines spare since we only used 1 for the bulwarks. DP is also less of an issue, so it's a pretty major difference with the previous run. Now I'm going to activate Sudaram as soon as the Altar Keeper passes the bottom Chalice. This is because I don't want to slow down 2 bulwarks that will be coming pretty soon. Otherwise, the rest of the burst phase is pretty similar to the previous run, with just Ines baiting the top beam and providing a bit of bind so that the Altar Keeper doesn't have time to actually reach the middle of the blue box. Now, I'm gonna have to bait an attack on the right side using Gravel. Sudarans are attempting their attack, but nothing to worry about. VAD is being deployed to push a Sudaram to make sure that he can't do his attacks while being in the storm, because if the top right Sudaram is in the red box, he won't be able to do any global range attack. And right after this, I need to deploy Chilchuck. So if you take a look at Chilchuck's timer, there's only 3 seconds left. And the Bulwarks are out of the way because Sudaram's skills ended earlier than usual, meaning I can deploy Chilchuck without him dying. Ifrit and Ella are saved, Chilchuck is retreated, with Ifrit taking a single tick of damage, and Surfer is there and is going to generate some DP while baiting the beam. At this point in time, I know that the Bulwarks won't have time to reach Surfer, so all I'm doing is taking a look at the right side at the Soul Remnants to see when the beam activates, and I'm ready to retreat Surfer. And there we are. Compared to the previous run, I have both Ifrit and Ella alive, which is great because Ella can serve as an additional source of fragile if need be. Gnosis can be deployed next to the blue box compared to the previous run because, as mentioned, Logos did some damage to the Chalice at the very beginning of the game, so the Soul Remnants are about to die. If you take a look on the right side, I don't need to deploy a Tex Altar, that I don't have, and dies just barely before doing a normal attack, so the timing was a question of a few tenths of seconds at this point. Now I can use Gnosis to actually freeze the Chimera. Do note that I don't need to activate Sudaram's skills right away because it is already providing up to 60% fragile with his module at level 3. I do have his module only at level 1, but in this particular case it didn't matter. All skills can be activated, and the Chimera will definitely die with all that we have available. Sudaram's skills are activated a bit early because Ifrit would have otherwise died from using her skill 3. We can reject Gnosis, he has done his job. Ella can provide a bit of extra damage to the Chalice, and we're gonna be using some of the mines to slow down the Sudarams and buy a bit of time. Now, this is why it's important to actually clean up the tile at the very start of the game. I can deploy Chilchuck safely and generate a bit of DP for the very end, which wouldn't have been possible if I didn't actually move the altar to the left. Now, the Sudaram is getting closer and closer. The Chalice is not going to go straight for the blue box, not just yet. It has another checkpoint to go through. At this point, you have a few ways to approach this strat. I'm going to kill the Sudaram separately from the Chalice, which is why I have Nymph and Maelstrom set up. The riskier strat consists in actually using the fact that Sudaram is here to actually destroy the Chalice, but I was getting kinda tired and I wanted to go for a safer option. Here, Ella's mines are used to slowing down, and Gravel is going to be used to slightly bait the attack. There's a specific frame which can be used to make sure that the Sudaram does a full spin. Ines is deployed right after to abuse the fact that the attack cooldown of the Sudaram is still ongoing. And the Sudaram will die just in time. As you can see, the timing is very tight. With this, I can remove most of the operators and place Nymph and Maelstrom. Now, another note is that if you pay attention, Nymph is attacking the altar, which is a bit awkward because it's pretty difficult to know what the right timing is. So what I will do is wait for Nymph to do a normal attack on the Chalice before activating the skill, which will result in the Chalice getting very close to the middle of the blue box. But I cannot afford at this point to mess up skill 2 usage. This part is not the most exciting, but it is a particularly stressful and particularly long one because the Chalice is extremely tanky. At this point, I'm using Sudaram to buy a bit of time and allow Nymph to regenerate a bit of SP. It's not particularly necessary, but it's better safe than sorry. Chilchuck in the meantime will be deployed to generate a bit of extra DP, allowing me to bring Logos and have a bit of extra DPS to speed things up. At this point in time, the run can be considered over because ultimately I can just pay attention to what the operators are, I can pay attention to the normal attacks from Nymph, and the Chalice will never get to the blue box. Which means that the run is effectively over. All in all, I spent approximately 3 hours a day trying a bunch of different strategies, and I had to skip over several runs, so you didn't get to see everything. All I wanted to do is just showcase the kind of thought process that goes into going and clearing a maximum risk for CCB3. So I sure hope you enjoy your time here, and I will make sure that you can enjoy the run in full with a bit of music in the background and without my full commentary. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe because those kind of videos take absolutely ages to make. And I'll see you on the other side.
Пусть черные сукна покроют, и пусть унесут фонари ночь. Уже безумие крылом души накрыло половину и поет огненным вином и манит в вечерную долину. И понял я, что ему должен я уступить победу, прислушиваясь к своему, уже как бы чужому бреду. И только пыльные цветы и звон кадильный, и следы куда-то в никуда, и прямо мне в глаза глядит, и скоро гибелью грозит огромная звезда. Перед этим горем гнутся горы, не течет. Прислушиваясь к своему, уже как бы чужому бреду.
The end justifies the means.